What is the very best source of heat that you can have living off grid? I've been off grid now for a year and a half. This will be my second winter, and I'm going to tell you guys what has worked best for me. I support myself living off grid by selling these unique tea blends that I've created myself. This one, an example, my red tea blend has rose petals, lemon balm, and hibiscus. Science shows that hibiscus can dramatically reduce blood pressure. And there's a lot of other wonderful health benefits. You should check out the reviews online. When I first came out to my land, there was no homestead. It was just land, and I lived in my van here. And an easy, affordable way to heat the van was to use propane. Inside the van, I have a little kitchenette, and I just have a little simple propane burner like you might use for camping. I cut a hole in the table and put it in there, and I would run the propane. There were a few different issues with running the propane. However, it did work in a pinch. Running a simple propane burner requires ventilation and circulation. I have a fantastic fan on the roof of the van. I can crack that. Gases can expel. There's also holes in the floor, which will allow gases to vent, and propane gas would sink actually more likely than rise. It's just not quite enough heat to simply have a burner. You have to have circulation, so a fan that blows that heat throughout the van makes a huge difference. Here's the problem with propane. For every molecule of propane that is burnt, a molecule of water is created. In a simple setup like this, you could potentially create gallons of water overnight, and that water has to go somewhere. So it gets into the boards, it gets into the walls and the floor. It can cause mold and issues. For a big chunk of the first winter, I did use propane in the van where I live to heat my area. But in my shed, I used wood. In my shed, I have a wood burning stove, which obviously requires a chimney to be installed. And throw the wood in there, light it up. It's a really great heat source. If you were completely off grid and had no source of fuel, I would say by all means wood burning is the very best source of heat. If you've got enough trees around, you can cut down your wood and you can plant more trees and try to maintain. If you're buying wood, however, it's pretty expensive, and it could be cheaper to burn propane than it could be to burn wood, depending on how much you're paying per load. If you're cutting the wood yourself, it's a whole lot of work to get several cords. Even just this little shed requires several cords of wood to burn throughout the winter. Wood heat is way better than propane heat when it comes to the dryness. It's just a really good dry heat. There are a lot of benefits to wood, and having a wood burning stove, you've got something heating, you're also able to cook on it, and there's just nothing really replaces having a fireplace burning, right? Definitely my very favorite source of heat is wood. I used to be a truck driver, and you can't just run your truck all night long. It's hard on them to just sit there and idle, and they used to do that a lot. But a company created what was called the Webasto heater, and it's powered by diesel fuel. And they could just tap right into the fuel tank in the truck and blow really nice dry heat. And it's very cheap actually to run a diesel heater. Personally, I've experienced that it only costs about $1 a day for me to run heat frivolously, just about as long as I want to. After running propane for about 6 months or more in the van, I upgraded to a Chinese version of the Webasto heater. I never had one before because Webastos are about $1,500 a piece, but once their patent expired, I believe, then there were Chinese companies that were like, hey, let's bang these out, and they made pretty good versions of this heater for around $200. So I put one of those in the van. I have never run the propane for heat since, and the heat is much better. It's just cozier in there. If you can get it set up with a thermostat, you're pretty set. And it'll be the middle of winter, super cold. Like last night, 30 degrees, right? I got the door cracked wide open, and I'm totally warm in there. It's just that efficient. So recently I received another diesel air heater over here, and as you can see, I'm actually heating water to make a cup of tea. And when I drove truck, I would, let me see, oh yeah, we're getting hot in there. I would put a can of soup in front of my Webasto heater and cook soup on this thing. So you might wonder, why did I set up another diesel heater in the shed? The main reason is it's just so simple. I have a fuel station on the homestead, and I'm able to get enough fuel to last me the entire winter. I winterize the fuel, it's completely safe, and I can just top the tanks off every day or two. And like I said before, it costs me about $1 a day to run just about as much heat as I want out of one of these Webasto styled heaters. While wood absolutely has its place, and if you were absolutely off grid and had no other source, wood is the very best source of heat living off grid. But if you're in a situation where you still go to town occasionally, you still have access to fuel, it might be a lot less money and a lot less resources to burn fuel instead of wood. If you're concerned about hauling fuel into your homestead, you can make a simple fuel station like this. I've got a tank for fuel, one for gas, and then another tank to haul fuel in, and then I just pump the fuel over. This tank will last me just about all winter long, if not the whole winter, and I just simply treat it, and you know, I'm keeping it out of the direct weather so water can't get down in it, and I've never had a problem storing fuel. So there's definitely a good way to have a larger amount of fuel on your homestead. Another option people have brought up for heating would be solar, and it's an option I never even thought of. And the reason why is because if you are going to heat with solar, you're going to need a really large system. The most demanding appliances are those that create heat or cooling effects. In example, a crock pot would take a ton of energy. Running an air fryer would take a ton of energy. Running any sort of heater would take a ton of energy. Personally, I have about a 9 kilowatt solar system. I haven't even tried, but there's just no way that I would be able to run heat all night long. And that's usually when it's the coldest, is at night. And you're going to be demanding a ton of energy to run a heater that runs off of solar when there's no sun. It just doesn't seem very economical to me, unless you just had a massive system. But you got to keep in mind, you'll be burning that system out as well, you know, and you'll have to replace it eventually. Personally, I like to have multiple ways to heat myself if necessary, and everything I do, for water, I want to have multiple ways to get water. I want multiple ways to heat, and that way if something fails, then I have another source. Right now, I have a wood burning stove that's in my shed. I use often. I like to cook roasts on my wood burning stove. If I'm running it, then I don't have the Webasto heater going. I also have an old kerosene heater that happens to run really well on diesel, and so diesel being cheap, kerosene not so much, I will run my kerosene heater with diesel, and it works really well too, and you can cook on the top of it. So this is what the kerosene heater looks like, and you know, you just light that thing up and it'll run. A tank would probably last 6 or 8 hours, so not as efficient as the Webasto heater, but another source of heat nonetheless. In order to run the heater like this, you just need access to 12 volt power, so that wire runs over to my battery bank. There's just a fuel tank on the top, and you could easily rig up a much larger tank. There's a fuel pump that pulls fuel from that tank down into the motor, and it has an intake. This is the air intake. The exhaust actually goes out the wall. There's fireproof tape around it, and the exhaust goes outside. This is where the exhaust comes out, and eventually I'll run that pipe all the way up underneath this IBC tote. And there's a lot of heat that comes out of that, and it'll simply keep this tank from freezing. My other tanks don't have such a problem because they're in the sun the entire year. They rarely freeze at all. But this one's on the north side of the shed, and a couple, 2 or 3 times a year it'll freeze. After being out here off grid for a year and a half, you know, I'm really out here. If it's cold, I have to heat myself, you know. I don't have, you know, regular utilities. And I have definitely found that the diesel heater is the most economical and best heat that I can get. And then, like I said, it's wonderful to have a wood burning stove as a backup. And if everything goes down for some reason and you can't get fuel, then you got wood, you know. So it's a good thing to have that system in place as well. Ultimately, it's going to be up to you. It's subjective what heat source is best for you. But for me, the diesel heat has been the very best. However, like I pointed out, I have multiple sources of heat, and it just happens to be the most convenient and most economical for me. If you're interested in learning to build an off-grid homestead with next to nothing, you should check out my book. It's on Amazon. It was a best new seller and a bestseller in multiple categories. In this book, I tell you how I started gardening. I talk about my geothermal greenhouse that I built. I talk about everything before I even had a homestead. Thanks for tuning in, guys, and I'll catch you on the next video.